The water was the wrong temperature. That was the first thing Rael Voss noticed when he clawed his way to the surface. Not the crowd forming at the edge of the municipal fountain. Not the blue daylight stabbing into his eyes like something personal. Not even the fact that he was fully clothed and bleeding from 3 fingers on his left hand. The water was 18 degrees when it should have been something else. Something colder. Something that didn't have the smell of recycled city runoff and chemical treatment. Something from before. Before what, he could not say. He stood up. The fountain was shallow, barely to his knees, and he stood in the middle of it like a man who'd been placed there by someone else's bad decision. People on the surrounding plaza had stopped to stare. A food vendor had lowered her tray. An old man on a bench watched with the calm interest of someone who had lived long enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Rael looked at his hands. Combat calluses. A scar along the right thumb that he had no memory of earning. He was wearing a tactical compression shirt and dark trousers and boots that had seen serious use. Heels worn, upper panels scuffed to gray. He reached for his face and found a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. When he tried to remember the last thing he'd eaten, he got nothing. When he tried to remember his name, it took 4 full seconds, and even then it arrived like a word in a foreign language that he happened to know the translation of. Rael. That was his name. And there was something else. Not a memory exactly, but the emotional residue of one. The outline a memory leaves behind when it's been scooped out and carried off. A weight in the chest that had the specific gravity of a child's hand in his. Small fingers. A voice that called him Da Mara. The name hit him like a physical thing, and he gripped the fountain's stone rim to steady himself. His daughter's name was Mara, and she was gone, and he did not know where or how or to what. And standing in the middle of a public fountain in a city he didn't recognize. He understood with total clarity that finding her was the only thing in the universe that mattered. He climbed out of the fountain. Someone offered him a hand and he took it without looking at them. Said something in a language that came automatically. He wasn't sure which one, and walked off the plaza with water streaming from his clothes, and a headache building behind his eyes like pressure behind glass. He had 3 things. The name Rael Voss, the name Mara Voss, and of an image that wasn't quite memory but wasn't quite dream. A dark ceiling ribbed with organic architecture, bodies on slanted slabs, a green glow that pulsed in a slow cardiac rhythm, and a child's eyes looking up at him through the bars of something that had no business existing in a sane universe. He had nothing else. No phone, no money, no idea what year it was. He found out the year from a discarded newspaper outside a pharmacy. The number meant nothing to him in one way, and everything in another. He sat down on the pharmacy step and looked at it for a long time, doing the arithmetic. Last clear memory, Mara was 6. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with her tongue pushed between her front teeth, the way she did when she was concentrating. He'd been called in on a job, a surveillance job, he thought, something to do with anomalous readings at an industrial complex outside the city. His team had gone in. And then the arithmetic. The number in the newspaper minus the year Mara was 6. He was looking at a gap of 11 years. 11 years he breathed through it. He was good at breathing through things. Whatever he'd done before, and the calluses and the scars and the way he'd instinctively cataloged every exit from the pharmacy without deciding to suggest it a profession. He had been good at not panicking. That discipline was still there even when everything else wasn't. He used it now. He stood up, checked his pockets again, found a small flat piece of metal with no obvious purpose, but which fit too perfectly in his palm to be accidental, and walked. Tavian Cross found out his wife was missing at 3-4 on a Tuesday. He'd been in the middle of cleaning his equipment after a job. The kind of job that paid well and asked nothing but discretion and a very specific set of skills that Cross had spent 20 years cultivating. He'd worked for men who needed problems removed quietly. He'd been good at it. He'd told himself he was done with it 6 months ago, when Sarah had looked at him across a dinner table in their apartment on the 14th floor and said, quietly and without accusation, that she wanted a child and she didn't want to raise one, wondering if her husband was coming home. He'd agreed. He'd meant it. He'd taken one last job, the way men always did, and come home to find the apartment lit and empty, and the window above the kitchen sink standing open in a way that Sarah never left it. She was particular about the window. She'd grown up in a city where you didn't leave windows open after dark. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment. He checked the apartment. Methodical, room by room, closets and under the bed and behind the bathroom door. He checked the building's corridor. He called her phone and heard it vibrating on the nightstand. He sat down on the edge of the bed with her phone in his hand and understood that something had happened that was not within the logic of the world he knew. There was a smell, faint but distinct. Ozone and something underneath it, organic and sweet and deeply wrong. The way certain chemical compounds are wrong, the way your body knows before your brain does that something is hazardous. He'd smelled it before. Once, 18 months ago, at a job site where a client had hired him to extract a researcher from a facility that turned out to be something else entirely. The researcher had said things about the facility that Cross had not believed at the time. He believed them now. He packed a bag in 4 minutes. He left the apartment. He did not call the police. They met in a corridor of the city's public medical center, which was not poetic but was accurate. Cross had been following a lead, the kind that required breaking into a hospital records room at 2 in the morning. When he'd nearly walked into the man standing in the fluorescent wash of the corridor, holding an ice pack to the back of his head and staring at nothing with the flat focus of someone running internal calculations. "You were in the fountain," Cross said. He'd seen the security footage. He'd been looking at it because the fountain was 3 blocks from the last place Sarah's phone had been detected, and in the footage, there was a shape in the water that shouldn't have been there, and then a man standing up from it. The man with the ice pack looked at him. Something crossed his face. Not recognition, not yet, but the professional assessment of a man evaluating a potential threat. He determined Cross wasn't one, which told Cross something about the man's threat threshold. "I was," the man said. He had a faint stutter, the ghost of one, like a sentence always starting on a faulty track and then correcting. He was American, Cross thought, or had been. There was something else under the accent. "My name is Tavian Cross. My wife disappeared 36 hours ago. I've traced her disappearance to the same." He paused because the next word was difficult even now. "The same source as yours. You don't know what my source is." "No. But I know what I smelled in my kitchen, and I know what I saw in that security footage. And I know that the mark on the back of your neck didn't come from this hospital." The man touched the back of his neck involuntarily. Cross had sharp eyes. The mark was small. A puckered circle, pink and recent, where something had been attached and then removed. He'd seen the same mark on photographs the researcher had shown him before the facility burned. The man with the ice pack was quiet for a moment, then, "Rael Voss, I have a daughter, Mara. He stopped and the arithmetic came across his face. She'd be 17 now. If time, he stopped again, started again. She was taken 11 years ago, from me, and I think I've been with them since. I think they had me and I got out and I don't know how." Cross looked at him. "Tell me what you remember." "Not much. A facility, dark. Things that looked like men but weren't. A green light that made everything feel." He searched for the word, attenuated, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Cross nodded slowly. "The researcher called them collectors. That's not their name. They don't have one we can pronounce. But they collect. They've been doing it for a long time. What do they want?" "From what I understand, the only thing we have that they don't." He paused. "Life force sounds theatrical. Chi. If you've read any Eastern philosophy, bioelectric resonance, if you prefer the clinical term. The living current that runs through every human nervous system. They don't have it natively. They can approximate it. That's what the green devices do. The ones they attach to the neck, they create a current, but it's a copy. It degrades. So they need the source." Voss was quiet for a long time. The ice pack had stopped being useful, but he kept holding it. "My daughter," he said finally. "Yes. Children produce more of it." Cross didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Where do we go?" Voss said. The woman who helped them was named Dr. Una Patel, and she had been waiting for something like this for 11 years. She was a trauma specialist at the medical center, and she'd been the one to treat Voss when the police brought him in from the fountain. And she'd been the one to notice that the readings from his neural scan were unlike anything she'd documented in 20 years of practice. Not abnormal in the way of disease or damage, but abnormal in the way of something additional, something layered on top of normal human neurochemistry, like a second annotation in a margin. She'd taken samples. She'd said nothing to anyone. She'd waited. She met them in a staff room at the end of the neurology wing and poured 3 cups of terrible machine coffee and sat down across from them and said, "I know where they are. I've known for 8 months. I've been trying to figure out how to do something about it." She spread documents across the table. Satellite imagery of an industrial compound 40 kilometers from the city, occupying what appeared on official records to be a decommissioned water treatment facility. Thermal maps showing heat signatures that didn't correspond to water treatment or any other known industrial process. And she pushed this one across last. A photograph taken through a long lens, grainy and partially obscured by chain link, showing a figure in a hooded garment that was not quite standing the way a human body stands. The proportions were almost right. Almost. There are humans inside, she said. Some of them are. She chose words carefully, too far gone to bring back. The process, when it's been running long enough, it removes something that isn't just physical. Something else. She looked at Voss. But there are others. Children, mostly. The process is slower with children. More careful. They're preserving the source. Voss's hand on the table was very still. How many of them? Cross said. Collectors? At any one time, I've counted 6 distinct thermal signatures that don't read as human. But they shift. They can occupy different forms. The number on site changes. Armed? Not with anything we'd recognize as weapons. They don't need them. Their physical capability. She stopped. I've seen them fight, Voss said quietly. It came from somewhere he wasn't fully remembering. A flash of dark corridor, a hooded shape, moving at a speed that physics had no strong opinion about. His own body responding from some trained place that his amnesia hadn't reached. I can handle it. Cross looked at him sideways. You don't know that. I know my hands do. The rest of me can catch up. They went at night, which was Yuna's recommendation. She had observed that the collector's activity patterns around the perimeter decreased significantly between 2 and 4 in the morning, not from anything like sleep, but from what she theorized was a maintenance cycle. A period when the devices they wore went into low-output mode to prevent degradation. A window, not a large one, Cross drove. Voss rode in the passenger seat and was mostly quiet, and Yuna sat in the back with a bag that contained things she'd been quietly acquiring for 8 months. An electromagnetic pulse device she'd built from components with a story he'd need another night to explain, a portable scanner, and 2 injectors loaded with a compound that, she explained, disrupted the bioelectric transfer process. Blocked the mechanism the green devices used to siphon. Temporary, 40 minutes, maybe less. You inject them? Cross said. You inject yourself, she said. It makes you less visible to them. Like, she searched for the analogy, like going dark to radar. They track by resonance. Reduce your resonance, they have a harder time finding you. Voss took one of the injectors and looked at it. He had a thing about needles, or had once. He could feel the residue of that aversion like a faded stain. He injected himself anyway, in the forearm, and felt a strange subsiding sensation, like a hum going quiet, like being suddenly and incompletely alone in his own nervous system. How do you know any of this works? Cross said. I don't, Yuna said, but we're going anyway. Cross almost smiled. Voss actually did. The compound was quiet in the way that wrong places are quiet, which is different from the quiet of empty places. Empty quiet is neutral. Wrong quiet has weight. It settles on the skin. The chain-link fence around the outer perimeter had been reinforced, and the reinforcement was not the kind that water treatment facilities needed. And the lighting pattern was irregular, in a way designed to avoid the predictable gaps that human security teams exploited. Whatever had arranged this perimeter had understood threat assessment. Cross cut the fence in a place where the camera arcs created a 60-degree blind zone. He'd mapped it from Yuna's data and his own reconnaissance past 2 days before. Driving a delivery truck he'd borrowed without asking. He was precise about it. Practice cuts, no hesitation. The economy of someone for whom entry under pressure was vocabulary rather than vocabulary he was trying to learn. They moved through in single file. Voss went second. He was watching the compound's main structure. A long, low building with a secondary tower that had no business being on a water treatment facility. And something in the sight of it was moving in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Or, it had everything to do with fear. The specific variety that comes from seeing the place where someone you love has been kept without your knowledge. A hooded shape appeared at the far end of the building. Voss went still before his brain issued the instruction. Pure muscle memory. The shape moved along the wall in a patrol pattern, unhurried, precise, and he watched the geometry of it, and counted seconds and identified the gap, and touched Cross on the shoulder twice. Cross nodded. They crossed the open ground in the gap and reached the shadow at the building's base and stood against the wall breathing. The smell was there, ozone and sweetness. He knew it now from 2 different places, the hospital corridor and something older, something that lived below the amnesia, and it made his jaw set and his breathing go careful and deliberate. East door, Cross said. Almost no sound to it. The east door was a service entrance with a keypad lock. Yuna had the Obtained, she said, through a method she preferred not to document, and she ran it, and the door opened on a space that was dark and smelled of recycled air, and the ozone smell concentrated until it was nearly a texture. They were inside. What the facility looked like inside was something Rael Voss's body remembered before his mind caught up. Long corridors with organic-looking ridging along the ceiling, as if the walls had been grown rather than built. A light source that was blue-green and sourceless, filling the space evenly without shadows. Slanted platforms along the main corridor, each one occupied. He made himself count, each one bearing a human form. Some of them were wired with the green devices at the neck. Others were not yet, and those were the ones that moved occasionally. Shallow breath, slow movement, not unconscious but not awake either. He walked the corridor, his hands were shaking. He was aware of it, and he let it happen, because the hand shaking was the true response to this place. And suppressing it would cost him something he needed for later. There was a woman with gray-streaked hair on the third platform who looked like she had been here for a long time. There was a teenage boy whose face had the blank quality of someone whose inner life had been significantly reduced. There were children, he counted 7, ranging in age from what he estimated as 5 or 6 to maybe 14, and he went to each of them with a controlled urgency and looked at faces. Mara would be 17. He found her near the back of the room, in a bay slightly separate from the others, and the sight of her hit him somewhere language didn't reach. She was taller than he'd let himself imagine. Her face had changed in the way faces change between 6 and 17. The bones had redistributed, the softness had moved to make room for something more defined. But the line of her jaw was his jaw. The wide set of her eyes was her mother's eyes, and she had the same habit, apparently still, of having both hands tucked under her chin when she slept, which is what she appeared to be doing. She was not wired, he breathed. He reached for her shoulder and stopped himself, because somewhere in what he remembered about this place was the information that sudden contact in the wrong way caused a kind of cascading reaction in people who'd been under the influence of whatever they did here. A shock to the system, dangerous. He crouched beside the platform instead and said her name quietly, just her name. Her eyes opened. For a moment she looked through him the way you look through things when you're surfacing from deep under. Then something crossed her face that was almost violent in its intensity. Not fear, not relief. Something that combined both and exceeded them. And she said a word that he hadn't heard in 11 years, and it sounded exactly as he remembered. Da. They almost made it out cleanly. Cross had located Sarah 3 bays from Mara. Alive, unwired. The compound apparently not having completed whatever process they intended for the newer arrivals. He'd woken her with more caution than Voss had ever seen a man his size deploy, and she'd come back to herself in pieces, recognizing him first by voice, and then by the specific way he held her arm when he helped her up, a thing that was entirely him and nothing else. It was at the exterior corridor, 40 meters from the east door, that the shape appeared, not one of the patrol shapes from outside. This one was different, larger in the wrong way, the hooded garment falling across proportions that were convincing from a distance, and progressively less convincing as it moved closer. It moved with the particular fluidity of something that had learned human locomotion as a second language. Behind its face, what served as its face, the green light pulsed with a steady, focused intensity. Voss stepped in front of Mara. He didn't think about it. His body was already between her and the shape before his higher reasoning had weighed in on the decision. The shape regarded him with something that might have been assessment, and might have been contempt. And then it moved. It was fast. Genuinely fast, in the way that made certain combat disciplines irrelevant, because speed made technique secondary. Voss felt this in the first exchange, a strike at his collarbone that he partially deflected and partially absorbed, backing 2 steps to maintain his balance. And then he stopped trying to read it the way he'd read human opponents, and started reading it the way you read weather. Not individual movements but patterns. Not the hand but the shoulder. Not the attack but the geometry that made the next one necessary. There was a thing it did. A rotation through the center axis, a pivot that moved its body out of striking range while bringing the arm back for a return, and it did it twice, which was all Voss needed. The third time it started the rotation he was already in a different place. He dropped under the pivot, drove up, and hit the green device at its neck with the heel of his palm with everything he had. The device cracked. The shape made a sound that the ozone smell made worse. It went to its knees. The green pulsing flickered, stuttered, went irregular like a power source failing. Its hands came up, Not to attack, he realized, but to reach for the device on its neck, and the motion had something in it that he would think about later, in a different light, with more complicated feelings. But he was a man who'd had his daughter taken from him when she was 6 years old, and who had been held in a place like this for 11 years of time he'd never get back. And, whatever complicated feelings were available to him in the future, right now there were none. He hit it again. It went down and stayed there. Cross was already at the door. Yuna had Sarah. Voss turned and found Mara standing 3 feet behind him where he'd told her to stay, watching him with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not shock, not exactly. More like the slow integration of information she'd been holding in theory for a long time and was now receiving as fact. "You came," she said. He started and then stopped because the word finally was in the sentence and he wouldn't allow it there, wouldn't grant the 11 years that kind of foothold. "I found you," he said instead. She looked at the shape on the floor. She looked at him. "I knew you would," she said. And she stopped to because some things are so large they need to be said in private, not in the corridor of an alien facility with ozone in the air and a door 30 meters away. He put his arm around her shoulders. She was almost as tall as him. That hit him somewhere separately. They walked toward the door. Outside the air was cold and tasted like ordinary soil and exhaust and the specific mix that constituted night in this part of the world. And it had never tasted better to any of them. Cross moved them fast, south along the fence line, away from the compound and toward the tree cover that Yuna had identified as their extraction route. No one spoke for the first 5 minutes. Sarah held Cross's arm with both hands. Mara walked next to Voss and slightly ahead, as if confirming with each step that forward was available. Yuna paused at the tree line and looked back at the compound. One light had changed. A window in the tower now showing the green pulse, bright and agitated. "They'll recalibrate," she said. "Come back in force, what we did tonight." "I know," Voss said. "You bought time, not an end. Time is enough." He looked at her. "Time is what I've been out of." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, and they went into the trees. What came after was not simple, because nothing after that night was going to be simple, and they all understood that. Cross made calls from a prepaid device he'd had the foresight to acquire. Yuna began the process of taking her documentation somewhere it couldn't be buried. She had contacts in 2 universities and 1 international health organization, and she intended to use them all. Mara sat in the back of the vehicle, with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open, watching the city appear through the windows as if checking it against a long-running internal model. "You don't have to talk," Voss told her. He was in the passenger seat. He'd turned enough to see her. "I know," she said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. "About the ones we left there. The gray-haired woman. The boy." He'd thought about them too. He'd thought about them the moment he'd made the calculation of who he could carry and who he couldn't. It was the kind of calculation that men in his former profession were trained to make, and that he'd spent 11 years being asked not to make. To simply process, simply exist, simply function as a source of whatever they were taking. The calculation had come back to him completely. He didn't feel clean about it. "We'll go back," he said. She looked at him. "Not alone next time," he said. "Better prepared. With what Yuna's putting together, with other people who know what's in that compound." He paused. This was a proof of concept, a rescue mission. That too. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She almost smiled. It was the ghost of an expression he remembered from years he didn't have, and it undid him slightly in a way he held together on the outside. "You sound like you have a plan," she said. "I sound like a man who just found out he has a daughter who's almost grown and is very clearly capable of asking hard questions, and who he would like to continue having available to ask them." He paused. "The plan is secondary." She did smile then. It lasted only a moment. She was 17 and had grown up in a place that did not encourage ease. But it was there, and it was real, and it was the most ordinary beautiful thing he had seen in 11 years. 3 weeks later, in a rented apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had good sight lines and 2 exits, Voss sat at a table with a map, and Yuna's documentation and a cup of coffee he'd been letting go cold. Cross was in the kitchen making actual food. He cooked, which had surprised Voss and delighted Sarah, who had taken the position that whatever came next was not going to be faced on a diet of vending machine provisions. Mara was in the next room. Voss could hear her talking to someone on the phone. She'd been reconnecting with what was left of her life's external structure, old connections that had continued existing while she had not. It was a strange sound and a good one. He looked at the map, at the compound, at the estimated locations of 3 other facilities he and Yuna had identified from the collector's data. She'd taken a copy, methodical as ever, before they'd left. The facilities were spread across 4 countries. None of them were small. All of them were occupied. He thought about the gray-haired woman on the 3rd platform, the teenage boy with the absent eyes, the other children, the other people, the lives that had been interrupted mid-sentence and never resumed. He thought about them with the specific quality of attention that meant he was going to do something about them, and soon, and he was going to do it well. He looked at his hands again. Calluses, the scar on the thumb, the small flat piece of metal he'd found in his pocket on the first day, which Yuna had identified as a component from one of the collector's devices. Specifically, she thought, from a portal mechanism, which raised questions he was not yet ready to finish thinking through. He turned the piece of metal over in his fingers. The humans the collectors had been taking, they'd taken because of something humanity carried that the collectors couldn't generate themselves. A living current, something irreducibly alive, native to a species that had evolved through 10,000 years of loss and survival and grief and stubbornness, love, and every other thing that made the signal strong. They'd taken it because they needed it. Because whatever they were, however old they were, however many technologies and dimensions they had mastered, they could not produce the one thing they most wanted. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that when the collector in the corridor had come for Mara, it had not come through fear of what humans would do if provoked. It had come because it valued what humans carried, enough to protect the investment, to keep the source running. And it had not, apparently, fully accounted for what a human being with sufficient motivation was capable of doing about that. The signal being strong had its uses. He set down the piece of metal. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the map one more time with the expression of a man beginning a long project. Not with dread, not with joy exactly, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has been oriented to a task that is right for him. In the kitchen, Cross laughed at something. Mara's voice through the wall rose briefly and then settled. The city outside was ordinary and alive and going about itself. He drank his cold coffee. He started planning. What they hit in the end was not what the collectors had expected. They had expected isolated humans acting in desperation, statistically reasonable. It was how it had always worked. Individuals acting alone, finding a piece of the truth, trying to extract a single life from the system. Easy to contain, easy to redirect. The system had protocols. The system had always been sufficient. It had not accounted for the possibility that the 2 individuals it had miscalculated, the SWAT officer from a year that no longer existed, the operative who had retired too late and not late enough, would take everything they'd learned inside and use it to begin the longest, most methodically organized counter-operation in the quiet history of this particular kind of war. It had not accounted for Yuna's documentation reaching the people it reached, or for the network that began to form from the aggregated experience of people who'd also lost someone, also smelled the ozone, also found a mark on a neck, and understood it for what it was. It had not accounted for the fact that what made humans worth taking was exactly the same quality that made them extremely dangerous to underestimate. The signal being strong. The first additional facility fell 8 months after the night of the fountain. The second 3 months after that. Cross and Voss and a team of 7 others who did not have names in any official record moved through each one with the same careful economy, took back who could be taken back, disrupted what could be disrupted. Yuna built something from her documentation that began small and became, over time, something larger than any of them had designed. Mara was present for the 3rd facility. She had argued for it with a composed precision that told Voss she had thought about the argument thoroughly before making it, which was the argument, in a way, that whatever she'd been through had made her someone who understood what the stakes were and was capable of acting accordingly, and that keeping her in the rented apartment was not the same as keeping her safe. He'd known she was right. He'd hated that she was right. He'd agreed anyway, because she was almost 18, and she was his, and one of them had already missed 11 years. She was good in the field. He was not surprised. Afterward, they sat outside the 3rd facility in a vehicle they'd need to abandon soon, waiting for the window to clear, and she was checking her equipment with the same focused expression she'd had as a child doing homework, tongue pressed briefly between her teeth. He watched her. "Don't," she said without looking up. "Don't what? That face you make, the one where you're doing the years in your head." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't help it. I know. She put the equipment in her bag. She looked at him then, direct and clear-eyed and 17 going on something more. I know you lost them. I know I lost them. I'm not asking you to pretend that's fine. She paused. But we're here now, both of us, that's. She seemed to examine the word before using it. That's not nothing. Outside, Cross gave the signal. Clean. They could move. Voss put his hand briefly on the back of her head. The gesture of a father, awkward and certain at the same time, and she allowed it for a moment, and then ducked forward and opened the door. They moved into the dark. Not the dark of the collector's facilities, with their sourceless green glow and their architecture of extraction, and their ancient patient confidence that the taking would continue as it always had. Just the ordinary dark of a night that would become morning. That was enough. They moved through it well.